Hello and welcome to PTV World News. I am Jawad Tehami. You're watching the special live transmission regarding the 48th session of the Council of Foreign Ministers of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation that was held in Islamabad from 22nd of March and up till today, which is the 23rd of March, as Pakistan celebrated the Pakistan with the spectacular Pakistan Day Parade. And the dignitaries, the foreign ministers from all the OIC and their delegations were participating in this. And there were a lot of discussions on a range of issues. And officially, it has come to an end with a joint press stakeout by Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi and OIC Secretary General Mr. Hussein Ibrahim Taha. And during this important press stakeout, the Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi put forth some major outcomes of this particular thing. Let me just go through them quickly. The first one was the Islamobar Declaration. The second one was forceful resolution on Kashmir. The third one was also related to Kashmir, which is a comprehensive joint communique on the situation in Kashmir. And the fourth was the action plan to be taken regarding the Kashmir dispute. And then the fifth one, the Foreign Minister, which highlighted, was the operationalization of Humanitarian Fund for Afghanistan. And then the sixth was the appointment of Special Envoy on Islamophobia, as Pakistan put forth and tabled a resolution at the UNGA, which was adopted by consensus. And then the seventh point was welcoming the establishment of Rahmatul Lil Alameen Authority by the Prime Minister of Pakistan. And the eighth point was the resolution on threats to peace and security in South Asia. Regarding this, the Foreign Minister said that he had highlighted this issue with the President of the United Nations Security Council as well as the UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres. The ninth point was the Pakistan's proposal of convening the Ministerial Commission to deliberate on 140 resolutions that came under discussion during this high-level two-day moot which was held in Pakistan. The last point which he highlighted very emphatically was that he alluded to the fact that many foreign ministers and their respective delegations highlighted the Ukraine crisis, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi said Prime Minister Imran Khan, during his keynote address at the inaugural session of this 48th session of OIC Foreign Ministers Council, expressed his deep concern regarding the conflict over there and the dangers that are associated with the spillover of the escalation. And very categorically, the foreign minister called for the immediate cessation of the hostilities there and establishment of humanitarian corridor. And the session also urged both the sides to engage in a meaningful dialogue. And he also said that he met with Foreign Minister Mr. Wang Yi from China as well, and with Prime Minister Imran Khan. All the dignitaries had the consensus that this should be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy. Let me introduce my guests today who are joining me for the discussion over this, the particular major outcomes of this 48th session. I am joined by Ms. Madiha Afzal, who is a research fellow from Brooklyn Institute in Washington. And I'm also being joined by Mr. Tariq Farhadi, who is Afghan affairs expert. He has a deep insight into the regional affairs as well. Both of you, thank you very much for your time for this special live transmission regarding the historic 48th session. So let's begin with the issue of Kashmir. A forceful resolution has been passed by this August gathering of the OIC foreign ministers that was held in Islamabad. So let me begin with you, Ms. Madiha. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi was of the view. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi was of the view that we should move beyond resolutions and should chalk out the concrete action plans. How do you see this statement?
Just to clarify, you're asking about the statements on Kashmir?
Yeah. The major outcomes, the forceful resolution has been adopted by the 48th Council of Foreign Ministers, OIC, and the Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi that we should move beyond taking the resolutions and should actually chalk out the plan, action plan to deal with such issues.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I think it's important to make these statements. I think there needs to be, as the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister highlighted, more unity in the Muslim world, in the Islamic world on Kashmir, and that has not necessarily been forthcoming. So, we've seen Saudi Arabia, which has close ties with India, for instance, refuse to step up in the way that Pakistan wants on Kashmir. And so while these meetings are important to sort of put out statements, and of course Pakistan hosting this meeting was an important feather in Pakistan's cap, and Pakistan could sort of push its agenda forward on this, I think we'll have to see what really comes of this beyond these 2 days. I think significant steps taken, but we'll have to wait to see what action actually comes of this, whether there is unity in the Islamic world on this issue.
Okay, Mr. Tariq Farhadi, what do you think about this statement? Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi said we should move beyond resolutions and should actually go for the concrete action plan. So vis-a-vis the Kashmir dispute, has been lingering for over decades now, especially after the 5th of August 2019 illegal and unilateral actions by India. The OIC seems to have a very strong consensus on this. So what do you say about that?
That's correct. As Dr. Madiha Hafzal just said here, that it was important that this meeting took place in Pakistan. My experience of the OIC itself is that because it represents 57 countries, it's almost like a mini United Nations. It's very difficult to get consensus on a lot of topics. Different Islamic countries have different economic interests as well, as mentioned here by Dr. Afzal. And while they might agree on a lot of points, to put it in writing, it becomes a challenge. And to operationalize is becoming even a bigger challenge because of these economic interests. But certainly, it is the place of Pakistan to put some points like this on the table to remind the Islamic countries that the Kashmir situation remains unresolved, and especially the people in Kashmir don't have their own decisions about their future.
So, Mr. Tariq, when we talk about the concrete action plan, as you mentioned, that there has to be consensus, but because of the economic concerns of each respective country, it becomes a little difficult at the stage of operationalization. Recently, we have seen a great success on behalf of the OIC that was led by Pakistan, the passing of the UNGA resolution against Islamophobia and declaration of 15th of March as the International Day to Combat Islamophobia. That was a huge success. Don't you think after this success, there is a huge possibility and hope of, despite the economic concerns or the interest every respective country does have, they have the opportunity to evolve that consensus in order to deal with the burning issues the Muslim Ummah is faced with?
On the resolution that was passed at the United Nations regarding Islamophobia, I must recognize that this took a lot of effort on the part of Pakistan to table it in New York and to follow it. It took time. And this is a resolution really which is important for all the Islamic countries. And it was a diplomatic success to carry it through. It will benefit everyone. While we have absurd situations in the world, to give you an example of Taliban today in Afghanistan, they banned girls to go to school, from going to school. This is the type of things that creates Islamophobia. And this is the type of things that gives arguments to people who are active against Islam. So we must recognize that within ourselves, we have situations that hurt the cause of Islam, that misconstrue Islam, misinterpret Islam. I've just said in an interview on Kabul TV right now that in Islam, we don't find anywhere in any text that there is a limitation on how much a girl can learn. There's no limits. Why do the Taliban prevent girls from going to school? This is the type of things that create Islamophobia. While Pakistan, others
Mr.
make
Tariq,
so many
Mr.
efforts.
Tariq Farhadi, I beg your pardon for the interruption, but during his keynote address, Prime Minister Imran Khan alluded to this very particular fact that it's not because of certain elements in a certain community which happen to be the extremists or the fanatics, because he said that certain intensity or the scale of the extremism or fanaticism shouldn't be actually related to one single religion, because the fanatics happen to be within every community. So if a very small segment of those people who are trying to impose whatever they want, but we of course can't generalize, so that doesn't give any room to anybody to create a narrative against the Muslim community entirely across the globe.
Correct, correct. And I think that was important to say, because actions of certain fringe communities, fanatic communities, make the whole 1.8 billion Muslims uncomfortable in the world. Islam is a religion of peace. It's a religion where we have been ordered to go towards the other, to understand other communities, to interact with other communities. We have been ordered, actually, in the Book of Islam. So it is important. And those communities that close the door on Islam, that create an obscurantist view of Islam, are not doing any favor to Islam. And I must say that this resolution at the United Nations is very important for all of us. Yes.
Okay, Dr. Madiha, what do you think after the passing of this particular resolution? The OIC or the Muslim countries as a whole stand like a united front when they have developed a consensus on one single issue. There is a huge room for them to create a consensus on other issues where they are collectively faced with, no matter how many economic interests a certain single country has towards the West. When it comes to the snatching of the Muslim territories like Palestine and Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir by the dint of force, do you think there is a hope that once you have developed a consensus on one issue, you could step by step go towards other issues as well?
That's an important question, but the resolution against Islamophobia, that has to be commended. And that is an important achievement. And it's important to sort of put that out and recognize that. But that is something, as Mr. Farhadi mentioned, that is something that the entire, and as you mentioned as well, that's something that the entire Muslim world can agree on. It affects all of them sort of equally, right? It affects all these countries equally. It affects Muslims not living in OIC countries. It affects Muslims around the world sort of equally. However, sort of the matter of Kashmir, let's say, or the matter of the Palestinian cause, these are things that countries do have differing interests on within the Islamic world because of economic interests, because of their relationships with Israel, with the West, with India. And so I think it is a leap to say that something that the Muslim world is united on, Islamophobia, can then be extended to other issues where there is and has been very clearly a division in the Muslim world based on sort of foreign policy and economic interests. The other thing I will say is that when the OIC speaks about the Kashmiri cause or the Palestinian cause, there are other causes that it doesn't speak of, where Muslims' human rights are being hurt. So the Uyghur issue in China, the Rohingya cause in Myanmar. These are issues on which the Muslim world is conspicuously silent. And that lack of consistency is noticed around the world as well. And that is sort of clearing. The other thing I will mention, again, Mr. Farhadi mentioned
Dr. Madiha,
the
I would contest this point humbly over here. When we talk about the issues of Muslims, for example, in Palestine and Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, they have come to the fore. We have seen images coming all the time from there of the brutalities and the atrocities, the images and the visuals of a relentless bombing on the Palestinian settlements and the change of demography. And to mention this point, Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi, during his address last day, during the inaugural session, mentioned the Rohingya issue as well. When talking about Uyghurs, Pakistan's policy has been very clear about it. Pakistan's Foreign Minister and Prime Minister has repeatedly said that we have been engaging regarding this issue with the Chinese authorities on diplomatic levels, and there is nothing of a sort which the Western media is trying to portray.
That may be, what Pakistan is saying, right? But this is something where it's sort of a striking lack of consistency to engage privately on issues where it has been documented. The treatment of Uyghurs, the camps, this has been documented, but to sort of deny it, to kind of engage in a willful denial and say that this is an internal matter. This
Dr.
is
Madhya,
noticed as a lack of consistency by the rest of the world.
That could be the misrepresentation in order to create a narrative, because we've seen the US engaged in an economic war against the Chinese.
That may be sort of your interpretation of events, and that is certainly
that
the
was
interpretation.
exactly said by Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi during his UNGA interview with the CNN. And that is exactly Prime Minister Imran Khan is of the view that after 9/11, it was the sinister campaign by the Western media in order to make the Muslims around the globe vulnerable, just because of the acts of a minority of people. It's all about the battle of perceptions and making the narratives.
Perhaps, it has to do with perceptions, but there is a certain perception and a certain view being pushed here that is contested around the world, where it is quite clear that the Uyghur issue is an important one. And so it's important to note sort of the lack of consistency here. It is noticed around the world. And that's something, while you can say, that's something that Pakistan does not recognize, that's something that is noticed all around the world as an issue on which Pakistan remains conspicuously silent. And it's not just Pakistan.
Dr. Madhya, let me take this particular point to Mr. Tariq. What do you see? Isn't it the battle of perceptions? And especially when Prime Minister consistently and repeatedly alludes to the fact that it was the Western media that launched a sinister campaign in order to make the Muslims vulnerable. It could be the matter of changing the perception and building a narrative against the Chinese, because we have seen the US engaged in an economic war with the Chinese.
The treatment of the Uyghurs by the Chinese have been documented by many outlets. It is not only the Western media. It's a known fact. The Uyghurs are under pressure in China. The Chinese are sending Chinese descent people to the Xinjiang region to repopulate it, to almost delete religion from their lives. It is something which is known. It has been documented. Now, some might not want to talk about it for political reasons, but these are things that are known worldwide, and when we don't talk about it,
Mr.
then
Tariq,
it creates...
it's not that Pakistan doesn't want to talk about it. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi, in that very interview, said that we are engaged with the Chinese. If there might be some... there could be a possibility that there could be some fanatic elements in that community as well, but that doesn't render the entire community to be questionable. So let's talk about Afghanistan now. When we talk about this 48th session of the Council of Foreign Ministers of the OIC countries, Humanitarian fund 3 months back was established. Now the charter has been signed and it has been operationalized officially. How do you think it can actually help in order to avoid the humanitarian and economic crisis in Afghanistan?
Well, this will have its own challenges as well, because I, from my experience, said here that the Islamic world is not united on many things. The Islamic world does not see the Taliban the same way either. Many in the Islamic world, I would say the majority, are very, very uncomfortable with what's going on by the Taliban in terms of limiting girls from going to school and limiting women from working. This is something that the Islamic world has been fighting against, this image for the last 30 years, and has invested a lot. And certainly, I don't see major donor countries in the Islamic world contributing to a trust fund which would go directly to Taliban. Nobody wants to give any lifeline, a diplomatic lifeline, to the Taliban right now. Not the Afghans, not the girls, not the mothers, not our sisters, not the international community, and especially not the OIC, as the OIC has not recognized the government in Afghanistan. So this trust fund, it's Afghanistan Humanitarian Trust Fund, which is taken from the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, which used to exist at the World Bank, but now is under sanctions, US sanctions. So also the US has requested the OIC to create the Afghanistan Humanitarian Trust Fund. But I see it from experience. We have had this debate on PTV 4 months ago when the first conference was around. It's very difficult to put money in this trust fund because different Islamic countries view the events in Afghanistan differently. For Pakistan, it will be a liability to protect too much the Taliban with what they are doing inside Afghanistan right now. The Taliban are not a good example for the good show for Islam, and it's a liability what they are doing. This is what creates Islamophobia, the type of things that the Taliban or Boko Haram or sects like this are doing.
Okay, Mr. Tariq Farhadi, when we talk about recognition of the interim Afghan Taliban as a legitimate government over there, for now it is a de facto. So basically, does it has to be with all those conditions which were in the Doha peace deal, because they have to mend their ways in order to get that particular legitimization of their government? Is it necessary? Because we have to save the human lives over there, because the Afghan lives matter. And that is what Prime Minister Imran Khan has consistently said, that we should, the world, the international community should separate the Afghans from the Afghan Taliban for now, so that we can save human lives. So why such conditions? Why not give a sort of a legitimization to this government? Because there has to be some funding to be channeled in, that has to be through some hands. So for that, there has to be a government there.
So the international community has found a modus operandi right now in Afghanistan, where the United Nations and the NGOs and probably the Islamic Development Bank will be able to deliver aid to Afghans in need without condoning what the Taliban are doing. And what the Taliban are doing is an embarrassment to all of us, frankly. In no country in the world which is Islamic, girls are forbidden from going to school. This is dangerous. If we condone this, it will permeate other borders. It is dangerous for everyone, including Pakistan.
Mr. Tariq, please hold your thought over here. This is a very important point that you're repeatedly mentioning. I'll take this point to Dr. Madhiya. Now, if the Taliban are not letting the women go to schools, does it mean that the international community should come into aid, into help, to provide aid to avoid the economic and humanitarian crisis? That seems a sort of a interesting correlation. Okay, if I don't let the girls go to school, you won't let me to save the Afghan lives.
Humanitarian aid has to be decoupled from conditionality that has to deal with the recognition of the Taliban, right? So then there's sort of an economic relationship is established with the Taliban if there's recognition. That is a separate matter. Humanitarian aid goes directly to the Afghan people, and that is what governments around the world, including the West, including the OIC, including Pakistan, have been talking about. There is a push by some to recognize the Taliban, but that can be dealt with as a separate matter, and humanitarian aid to sort of save people from starving to death, save Afghan men, women, children from starving to death. That's a separate matter. And that's, something I think the world has been consistent on. The problem is the will to sort of generate and the ability to generate the money required for that. I think it's important for the OIC countries to step up in this regard because, the US, for instance, has given a great deal of humanitarian aid to Afghanistan over the last year. The West has as well. It's important for the OIC countries to also step up. At the same time, it's important for them to step up and put pressure on the Taliban to send girls to school. The Taliban had promised for 7 months, girls have not been able to go to secondary school in Afghanistan. The Taliban promised on Monday that on Wednesday, today, March 23rd, that girls would be able to go to secondary school. They showed up at the gates and they were turned away.
Do you think that remains to be the prime issue the Afghans are faced with, that after you give them some amount of aid and ask them to send the girls to school, and if they don't, then you stop that aid? We've seen that the US, after the Kabul takeover by the Taliban, there were $9.5 billion that were frozen in the US bank accounts, and now we have recently, a couple of weeks before, they've released around 7 billion. Out of 3.5 billion of that has gone for the American victims of war and terror. Don't you think that's injustice?
So I think you're conflating multiple matters here. There is the matter of the frozen funds, right? That is separate. The economic sanctions, that is separate. Then there's the matter of humanitarian aid. So humanitarian aid is something separate from getting the economy to function, and we can focus on those matters separately.
So there are two different issues. The short-term solutions and the long-term solutions. The short-term solution in order to avert the humanitarian crisis, and the long-term remains to be the economic revival. Please go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not that frozen funds and those sanctions are not affecting the functioning of the economy, which is in turn obviously affecting Afghans' ability to, feed themselves. That is true. What the West has done is try to sort of decouple those two issues, and there are problems with that as well. But I think nobody says that humanitarian aid should be contingent on anything the Taliban does, because the humanitarian aid goes directly to Afghan people. And of course, sanctions, etc., are a sort of a roadblock in the way of that. And there are a lot of concessions, including some that have been made by the US Treasury, that basically enable humanitarian aid to sort of not run afoul of sanctions, to get directly, to be delivered directly to the people. So that's
how
sort of a
is that
separate
delivered
matter.
directly to the Afghan people, with any authority being there in power? How is that delivered directly to the Afghan people?
There are international organizations, including
international
the UN.
organizations need to operate over there, and they have to have a liaison with the government over there on the ground.
Sure, but it doesn't go through the coffers of the government, right? So this is money delivered to these organizations that is then delivered directly to the Afghan people. That is sort of a workaround, given the fact that the funds are frozen at this point in time, given that the funds have been frozen. And again, that is a discussion that we can have. But I think it's really important to understand that nobody is saying that humanitarian aid ever should be contingent. That's an oxymoron, because humanitarian means that it goes directly to the people, and that should never be contingent on the actions or the conditionality that one imposes on the government. Now, the matter of sanctions, the matter of frozen funds, we can talk about separately. But I think, for the OIC, as I've said, just to get that point across, it's important for the OIC, yes, to talk about humanitarian aid, and that's something that will again be noticed and appreciated by the world. And one should commend OIC countries for doing that. At the same time, it's important for the OIC countries to talk about violations of human rights, including the fact that girls have not been allowed to go back to secondary school in Afghanistan today, and the fact that it coincided today is significant with the second day of the OIC conference. And so sort of a recognition, a statement being put out that puts pressure on the Taliban, I think would be something that would be recognized around the world and appreciated.
Okay, Mr. Tariq, yesterday we saw an audio statement coming from the interim Afghan government spokesperson, Mr. Sohail Shaheen, requesting the OIC moot and actually urging them that it happens to be their obligation to recognize the government over there in Afghanistan for the rehabilitation and reconstruction. Since this particular humanitarian fund has been established and now the Charter for Operationalization has been done now, do you think it happens to be a precursor for the later on recognition of this government there?
You know, it's nobody's obligation to recognize the Taliban. The Taliban are not trusted by the Afghan people. They don't have
what
Afghan
the statement
legitimacy.
Mr. Sohail Shaheen requested the OIC moot and telling them that it happens to be the obligation of OIC to recognize them.
Mr. Sohail Shaheen can request anything he wants. His government is not representative of the people of Afghanistan. His government is composed of Taliban only. They don't allow anybody who is a non-Taliban to be at the level of decision making. They have arrived, the people have not accepted them. The people don't relate to this government. We can say that these are people who were at war and they don't know the people and now they have to get used to the people. But we have been advising these Taliban in the last 7 months to do the reasonable thing, to open the door, to have a deputy prime minister who is a non-Taliban, to, for instance, create a ministry for children's welfare because there are 25 million children in Afghanistan who go hungry, and put a woman minister of this organization. Why not? It's totally Islamic to have a woman minister managing the affairs of children and families. But the Taliban are playing those whose hearing aid is blocked. And at the same time, they are asking for people to recognize them. There has to be a give and take. The Taliban have to correct their mistakes. The Taliban have to earn the hearts and minds of the Afghans. The Taliban have to stop being a liability for the entire Islamic world. And anybody who defends the Taliban is really going into a deeper well with all the negative surprises that they're giving us every day, day in and day out. So the government has to reform in Afghanistan, and it has to reform quickly. I understand that there are Talibans who are not okay with the decision to block women from going to school. Those Taliban have to declare themselves separate from those elements who are taking a very obscurantist way right now, because it's a dangerous time right now in Afghanistan. For the sake of Afghanistan, for the sake of the girls, and also we are talking here about for the entire Islamic perception by the rest of the world. We should not condone a government like the Taliban. We should not recognize a government like the Taliban. This would not be good news for anybody involved.
So, Dr. Madhiya, what do you say? What could be the solution in order to make the Taliban fulfill their promises? Do we have to form an alliance to put the boots on the ground once again? That's what we saw the Americans did a mistake 2 decades before. Or is there any other solution that you can make the Taliban? As Mr. Tariq said, that they are not open and they're not taking all the stakeholders over there in order to form the inclusive government. So what happens to be the solution? But they are the reality now. They are in control of the larger territory of Afghanistan. So what should the international community or the OIC for that matter should do?
the Taliban have to earn legitimacy in Afghanistan. And to earn that legitimacy, they have to form an inclusive government and they have to respect the human rights of the citizens whom they claim to govern. They took power by force, right? And to expect the world to recognize that taking of power by force when the world explicitly warned the world, including Pakistan, including the West. You know, Pakistan was part of a Troika Plus that warned the Taliban against taking over power by force. Pakistan, China, Russia, and the US put out statements. That was a forum in the run up to August that warned the Taliban against taking over power by force. The Taliban went ahead and did so anyway. And so, you know, they have to, in order to engage with the world, they have to engage with their people, first of all, and stop engaging in arbitrary detention, stop engaging in flagrant abuses of human rights against their own people, including the issue of keeping girls home from school. The international community has a few levers at its disposal, including sanctions, including recognition, including economic aid and economic engagement with the regime. They're going to hold on to those levers, but those levers are really, you know, frankly, quite limited. And the Taliban has shown that it is not willing to compromise in order for the West to sort of let go of those levers, right? That conditionality, you know, we're 7 months into this regime. That conditionality has not worked to date, and they are passing the buck off onto the West, for instance, for Afghan people starving, right? Rather than sort of, again, engaging in some reform. I think, you know, if one looks at
Dr.
the
Madhiya,
Taliban itself,
don't you think
it's
it's
a
that way? The reality happens to be that way because it's because of the American invasion of Afghanistan, and they are instrumental in forming different governments on the face of it, democratically elected governments over there. But as soon as we saw, there is another aspect that the Americans and the international coalition forces abruptly withdrew after 2 decades of subjugation on Afghanistan, and that left a huge vacuum. So it has more to deal with the Western strategy and unwillingness to stay in Afghanistan anymore and leave that vacuum. And whoever was fighting for that control, they came into power, and that happened to be the Taliban again this time around.
I think that's a very incomplete view and you know, an
Dr. Madhiya, there
interpretation of
were a
things
lot of
that happens
reports
to be
which were
yours.
mentioning that there was rampant corruption during the Hamid Karzai's government as well as Ashraf Ghani's government, and it were the Americans who were pointing to that corruption. There were no institution building. The corruption was rampant. So it owes this current humanitarian crisis and the economic crisis Afghanistan is faced with owes to the performance of the previous governments over the last 2 decades?
Sure. So, you know, Afghanistan, of course, is in you know, has had huge problems with the previous government as well, you know, and corruption was a fact. But when the US signed a deal, which many of us thought was problematic with the Taliban 2 years ago now, when the US signed a deal with the Taliban, the next step was for that Afghan government and the Taliban to come to a resolution, to come to a peace agreement. And they were given time to do so. They failed to do so. Now, you can say that there was a fault on the previous government side, but there was also clearly a fault on the Taliban side, which never let go of its military strategy when it came to taking over power, right? And so it's very important to remember these facts. Now, this is something that the West had said throughout, that if the Taliban take over power militarily, do not engage in the peace process. You must remember, of course, that there was a peace process in play in Doha, where the Taliban and the previous government were meeting. And there was a sort of pushback from both sides, yes, but there was pushback to a peace agreement. And at the same time, the Taliban kept engaging in a military strategy. You know, we saw that in 2021. And so, you know, the West had said that if the Taliban take over power militarily, these will be the sort of the economic repercussions it will face. And sort of those have come to pass. Now, the unfortunate aspect of that is that
Dr. Madiha, beg your pardon for the interruption.
let me
There
just
are
finish one
reports by the
sentence.
United Nations that after the Doha peace deal was signed, it was the Afghan National Forces and a couple of times the American forces also made the airstrikes over there, and the Taliban retaliated to that. And they were consistently saying that it was the international forces and the Afghan national forces which were actually violating the Doha peace deal. It was the Afghan government of Ashraf Ghani that didn't release because they didn't engage directly in negotiations with the Afghan Taliban. It was the US and the Afghan Taliban who were striking that peace deal.
They struck the peace deal in February of 2020, as you must recall. And then after that, that fall of 2020, a peace process was set in motion in Doha between the Taliban and the Afghan government. And that failed to go anywhere. So it was something where they met. There were representatives from both sides, and they met, and that failed to go anywhere. If both sides were serious about peace, that should have gone somewhere. And the fact of the matter, what you didn't let me finish my last thought and my last point was, the fact of the matter is that, because of the Taliban's takeover, there have been moves put in place, of course, against the Taliban regime that have ended up hurting the people of Afghanistan. And that is a very sad, sad outcome for the people of Afghanistan. But at this point, the regime that takes ownership of that country needs to step up and see what concessions it needs to make in order to benefit its people that it claims to want to rule.
Okay, let me talk about another point which was highlighted by Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi, the major outcome of this 48th CFM OIC. That is the resolution on threats to peace and security in South Asia. On 9th of March, we saw India fired a so-called accident of fire of a supersonic missile. Now, what Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi in his today's takeout has said that accidental fire could have led to an accidental war. What's your take on this?
I think it's really important to highlight threats to peace and security in South Asia. The fact of the matter, of course, is that Pakistan and India are nuclear-armed countries, and an accident could lead to war that can devastate, hundreds of millions of people and more. And this, so that's important to recognize. And I think the other factors that have been pointed out, sort of the threat from ISIS-K, the threat from the TTP, the threat from militant groups to Pakistanis, and sort of more broadly in the region to Afghans as well. ISIS-K attacks are up since last year, and of course in Peshawar there was a huge attack, a heartbreaking attack at a Shia mosque that killed dozens of people. Those threats need to be recognized, and a concerted effort needs to be made to counter them.
Dr. Madiha, let's specifically talk about this so-called accidental misfire of the supersonic missile that landed into Pakistan's territory. Given the fact India happens to be a nuclear-armed country, it does raise a lot of serious questions about the protocols to handle the strategic weapon systems. What role do you think international community, especially those which are concerned with the security of the weapons and especially the nuclear weapons, need to do right now?
Yeah, I think the international community has been relatively quiet on this, and that is a mistake. I mean, there is a lot going on in the world, and certainly the war in Ukraine has consumed the attention of much of the world. But and sort of Pakistan's mature response also has had an outcome where the world is relieved.
Does that render this mistake or a misfire less significant or less severe? If there could be a mistake and there could be a button which is touched that leads to a misfire of a nuke, then
right.
What would
I think
happen?
this is a very significant problem. So the international community, as I said, as I was saying, needs to take notice and actually raise questions. And actually needs to, India and Pakistan need to open a dialogue where they're actually talking about the safety protocols that they have in place. So there needs to be a dialogue between India and Pakistan, along with the international community, sort of making sure that the security of the nuclear arsenals is in place, and that these two countries, don't go to war over an accident like this again. So there isn't really room for accidents when it comes to India and Pakistan, unfortunately.
So, Mr. Tariq, what do you think? I mean, does it only require the raising of concerns and the serious questions, or should the perpetrators be held accountable?
Well, I think there are avenues within the United Nations, within the Conference on Disarmament, to investigate what happened exactly. And within the Indian Army, for people to be accountable for this dereliction of duty, basically, even without nuclear arms, missile falling on another country is not something that should happen. You saw that missiles were fired at Erbil in Iraq as well from, we don't know if it was fired from Iran. Missiles are being fired from Yemen to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE. It depends really on the access of different countries and their weight internationally to make those noises heard and publish articles and protest about it. But I think it was Pakistan was in its right place to bring this up, make it an issue, and I think it should be also made an issue at the United Nations. The other reality is that within the context of Ukraine war, India happens to be a country which is courted by every side. Everyone wants India to support their side, and within this time, India makes such a, I would say, mistake. So nobody wants to see their mistake because they still want India to vote on their side. It's a complicated matter. The world is becoming a complicated place, and some matters get lost in the shuffle, I would say. But from Pakistan standpoint, it was totally right to protest about it and to take this further, yes.
Mr. Tariq Farhadi, Afghan affairs expert, deep insight on the regional affairs as well. Thank you very much for your time being at this particular special live transmission regarding the 48th session of the Council of Foreign Ministers of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and Dr. Madiha Afzal, research fellow from Brooklyn Institute in Washington. Thank you very much for your time at PTV World as well. I really appreciate that. And with this, we come to the end of this special live transmission. And to conclude is that Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi has shared the major outcomes of this historic mood that was held for 2 days on the 22nd and 23rd of March in Pakistan. The first and the foremost was the Islamobar Declaration. The forceful resolution on Kashmir has been adopted as well, and the Humanitarian Fund for Afghanistan has been operationalized. Last but not the least, that Pakistan has once again made it clear to the international community that Pakistan wants to be partner in peace and not partner in conflict. Thank you very much for being with us.